This picture should look familiar to you. We covered this in Chapter 12. It's the organization of the nervous system. So to begin with a review of this, just like with the joints, we can also organize the nervous system by both structure and function. For structure, we have the CNS and the PNS, central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. CNS is your brain and spine. This is what receives information, makes decisions, and gives commands. PNS is peripheral nervous system. This is all the nerves that connect your body to your CNS. And remember, you learned in Chapter 12, a nerve is a bundle of axons of neurons. And a neuron is a basic cell of the nervous system. So the entire CNS is all made of neurons. And then you have the glia that support them. And a nerve is a bundle of the axons of neurons. And these are what run out and connect your sensory receptors to your CNS and connect your CNS to your effectors. Then with function, you have two basic functions. Sensory, which sensory is always going to be information going to the CNS. And this is also called afferent. Think of a divided highway. This is always information that is going toward the CNS. And sensory is divided into somatic and visceral. Okay, remember, somatic is what you are aware of. It's sight, smell, taste, hearing, touch. It's all the stuff you know you know. Visceral is subconscious. It's things your brain knows, but you're not consciously aware, like the composition of your blood, what your internal body temperature is, what your organs are up to. Then we have motor, which motor is commands from the CNS. And this is also called efferent. Okay, so again, with the divided highway, it's commands from the CNS. So it's always moving away from the brain and spine out to a body part. And we have somatic and autonomic. Somatic is voluntary. The only thing in your body you have voluntary control of is your skeletal muscles. Autonomic is involuntary. So these are the commands that your brain is giving, but you're not consciously deciding these commands. And the effectors for involuntary are cardiac muscle. That's why you see a picture of the heart there as the example. Smooth muscle, such as your blood vessels, your digestive system, and your glands, like sweat glands, salivary glands, tear glands. All of these things, skeletal muscles, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands, these are all effectors. Effectors are the body part that receives the command. This is what you learned already in Chapter 12. Now we are ready to build on this, expand on these ideas, and we're going to separate the autonomic into two divisions. So this chapter focuses just on autonomic. So autonomic has two divisions. And we follow color coding, and this color coding stays consistent throughout the book. So parasympathetic is always going to be in green. Parasympathetic is your rest and digest. So this is when you're calm, you're relaxed, and while you're resting and relaxed is when you tend to focus on digesting food, on healing, on general housekeeping of your body. So during this time, you're resting, so your heart and your breathing are going to be slowed down. You don't need those as active. And your digestion, healing any wounds, just kind of general housekeeping, maintaining the body. Those things are all going to be increased. Then at the other end, we have sympathetic. Sympathetic is your fight or flight. There's what's called the 3 E's of sympathetic. These are the 3 things that will cause you to be in sympathetic. That is emergency, exercise, and excitement. So anytime one of these 3 things is going on in your life, you're going to be in your sympathetic division. So this goes along with being active. So your heart and your breathing are going to increase. Okay, if you think about that, connect this to what you've already learned. You're going to be active, which means you're going to need lots of ATP. And in order to make ATP, you need oxygen and fuel to your cells. So you need to be breathing more, getting more oxygen, also getting rid of carbon dioxide that your cells produce when they make ATP. And you need your heart pumping so you can deliver this stuff to your cells. And at this time, your digestion, your healing, your general maintenance are going to go down, because you need to focus on the emergency that you're dealing with. So you tend to switch back and forth between these or be somewhere in between. It is a continuous scale. So you can have parasympathetic at one end, sympathetic at the other end. You slide back and forth. You could be here, or you could be here, or over here, or right in the middle. So depending on what's going on with you, you slide back and forth. And you can also think of it like a teeter-totter. Anytime that parasympathetic is up, sympathetic is down. So if your parasympathetic is turned up high, your sympathetic is turned down low. You could be kind of partially excited, and you could be perfectly balanced between the two. Or you could be in a full-on life-threatening emergency, and if you have sympathetic turned up, then parasympathetic is turned down. So this first one, with the parasympathetic high and the sympathetic down, this would be like when you're half asleep on the couch watching TV. In the middle, where you're kind of balanced, this would be like just typical day. You're at work or at school. You're active, but not full-on active. Maybe you're out shopping. The last one would be a full-on emergency. So like you are in a life-threatening situation. It could be that you're exercising, like maybe you're running a marathon. Or your favorite football team has just won the Super Bowl. Something really exciting has happened to you. This is when you have the adrenaline rush. So an adrenaline rush is part of your sympathetic response. So whenever you have sympathetic, you can add in here fight or flight and adrenaline rush. So there's an overview of what's happening, what this chapter is about. So remember, in your function, you have motor, and then under motor, you have autonomic, and then autonomic has these two divisions, parasympathetic and sympathetic. And you are constantly sliding back and forth between the two. And remember that whenever one of them is turned up, the other is turned down. You can't be fully in both. If you're doing more of one, you're doing less of the other. Now we're ready to look at the structure of the autonomic nervous system. We're going to begin by comparing it to what you already know about somatic. So this picture is somatic. So this is from chapter 14. You already know this picture. Remember, you have two motor neurons. You have the upper motor neuron This one would start from the motor cortex of the frontal lobe. It crosses over. So remember, the right and left sides of the body are connected to the opposite side of the brain. Then it goes here to the anterior horn of the spine. There it synapses with the lower motor neuron. And then the axon goes out through the anterior root to your skeletal muscle. So the basic setup of motor commands is an upper motor neuron from the brain to the spine. It synapses with a lower motor neuron that goes from the spine to the effector. So you have the upper is brain to spine, and then you have the lower is spine to effector. Notice also that the cell bodies are all within the CNS. There's no cell bodies out in the PNS. Okay, now that's for motor. You do have sensory cell bodies in the PNS, but not motor. And that is for motor somatic. Now we can compare this to the autonomic motor. So here's our picture of autonomic motor. Now this picture left the brain out, so let's draw a brain in here. So here's a brain. So you're still going to have that cell body starting from somewhere in the brain. It's not going to be a cerebral cortex though, it's going to be a subconscious part of the brain. It's going to come down and cross over and go into the spine. So here we have an upper motor neuron. It's going to have its cell body in a subconscious part of the brain. And that could be such as the hypothalamus or the medulla oblongata would be a couple of examples. It comes down here to the lateral horn of the spine. Then we synapse. Notice here we have two lower motor neurons. So here we have a synapse. Here's our cell body. And this is what's going to receive neurotransmitter from the upper. Okay, then its axon is going to go through the anterior root. And to a ganglion. So here we have a ganglion. So this does have a cell body out in the PNS. Then we have a second lower motor neuron. This one has its cell body in the ganglion. Where it receives neurotransmitter from the previous one. And then its axon goes to the effector. And since this is autonomic, the effector is either going to be cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or a gland. So we need to name these two lower motor neurons. So here we have two lower motor neurons. And we're going to name them for their relationship to the ganglion. So this first one here, the brown one, its cell body is before the ganglion. So this is the preganglionic neuron. And sometimes instead of talking about a whole neuron, we just talk about an axon. So its axon is called the preganglionic axon. The blue one has its cell body in the ganglion, so it is called the ganglionic neuron. But we don't often actually talk about a ganglionic neuron. We usually just talk about its axon, and its axon is after the ganglion, so it is called a postganglionic axon. This is the term we're going to use the most, so I'll put an asterisk there. In the remainder of the chapter, you're going to hear a lot about postganglionic axon. That's the one that goes from the ganglion to the effector and secretes neurotransmitter on the effector. So there's the basics of how autonomic is set up. You have one upper motor neuron from the brain to the spine. Then you have two lower motor neurons to get from the spine to the effector with a ganglion where the two lower motor neurons synapse. Now that you know the basic structure of autonomic, we can start comparing the two divisions, the sympathetic and parasympathetic. So we're going to use green for parasympathetic, and we're going to use purple for sympathetic. That is consistent throughout your book, this color coding. So parasympathetic comes from the brainstem and the sacral region of the spine. So because of this, it is also called the craniosacral. And from the brainstem, you have 4 cranial nerves. So you can see here, these cranial nerves. So this is cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10. We do that in the Roman numerals. There's the 4 cranial nerves that have parasympathetic function. Then down here, from the sacral, remember those nerves that come from the sacral region of the spine, they hang down through that cauda equina, and they come out here. And these are our pelvic splanchnic nerves. So for parasympathetic, you have from the brainstem 4 cranial nerves, and from the sacral region of the spine, pelvic splanchnic nerves. For sympathetic, it comes from all of this part of the spine. So this is the thoracic and lumbar. So because of that, it is also called the thoracolumbar. Here we can compare the upper and lower motor neurons. So here, the 2 lower motor neurons. Here is our parasympathetic, and here is our sympathetic. In parasympathetic, notice that the preganglionic neuron is long and unbranched. So here we have a long, unbranched preganglionic. In sympathetic, we have a short, branched preganglionic. In parasympathetic, because the ganglionic is so long, you end up with the ganglion in or near the effector. So you have 2 types of ganglion. You can have a terminal, is near the effector, or you can have an intramural, is inside the effector. For sympathetic, because the preganglionic axon is so short, your ganglion is going to be near the spine. So you can have a sympathetic trunk ganglion, which is going to be lateral to the spine, or you can have a prevertebral ganglion. Which is anterior to the spine. So if we come back up to this picture, these dots that you see here are the sympathetic trunk ganglia. So for sympathetic, the preganglionic axon is right here, these little short brown stubs. It's very short. Then your postganglionic goes from there all the way out to the effector. So the postganglionic is long. In parasympathetic, you would have the preganglionic would be very long. Right? It might come from here, it might come all the way out. And then you would have just a very short postganglionic. Notice that in both of these, your postganglionic is unmyelinated. Sympathetic and parasympathetic also have different goals when it comes to stimulating the receptors. For parasympathetic, its goal when stimulating receptors is to have precise local control. So it wants to just specifically pick out a particular receptor and stimulate that receptor, or effector, I should actually say. So the features that help with this are that you have that long, unbranching preganglionic axon. This way you deliver the signal directly to a particular effector. So, for example, parasympathetic stimulates your salivary glands and your lacrimal glands, which make tears. So it's possible to have tears without getting lots of saliva, or it's possible to have your mouth watering and getting extra saliva without crying about it, because you can have that precise local control. Parasympathetic is just the opposite. I'm sorry, sympathetic. The goal of sympathetic is mass activation. Sympathetic is what deals with emergencies. And when you have an emergency, you have kind of an all hands on deck situation. You want a huge response. You want all the effectors responding, and you want a full out response. So there are 3 different features we're going to look at to achieve this. So the first one is that short branched axon. So this short branched axon up here allows you to spread the signal out. And you get 2 things that happen as a result of having a short branched axon. You get convergence, which means one effector will end up receiving the signal from multiple neurons. So because all of these neurons are branching, you don't just have one neuron sending the signal to the effector. You end up with this repetitiveness of multiple neurons going to that effector. You also get divergence, which is where one neuron can branch to multiple effectors. So with all this branching and convergence and divergence, you end up with basically this web of axon stimulating effectors. So whereas the parasympathetic is more just a straight line to a particular effector, sympathetic is more of a web to all of your effectors. The second feature is this picture. So if we get some context for our picture, here's the preganglionic axon. Here's our postganglionic axon. Notice what happens when we get to the effector. This is our effector. This doesn't look like the typical synaptic knobs that we're used to seeing. Instead, you have what's called varicosities. So the end of the axon, it branches, and you have all these knobs like this, but it branches into a web that covers the effector. So you have this web of knobs that covers the effector. So the effector is blanketed in synaptic knobs. Each one of these secretes neurotransmitter. So you're soaking the effector in neurotransmitter. Think of it like a typical synaptic knob squirts a little bit of neurotransmitter on one spot, and it would be like squirting someone with a water gun. You'd get one little spot on that person wet. A varicosity is like having a whole bucket of water and dumping on them. You can completely drench the person with the varicosity. The third way that we get mass activation is the adrenal medulla pathway. The adrenal medulla pathway is what gives you an adrenaline rush. So if we look closely at this picture, remember the brown and the blue for preganglionic and postganglionic. Notice here from the spine all the way through this path out here to the adrenal medulla is preganglionic. So this is this one long preganglionic axon. Now this is an exception to the rule. Up here we had said that sympathetic has short branched preganglionic axons. This one does not. So this is an exception to the rule. It is a very long preganglionic axon. Okay, then notice you don't see any blue here. There's no postganglionic axon. This is your adrenal medulla gland. Now, glands secrete hormones into the blood. This is a special type of gland. The adrenal medulla gland is a neuroendocrine gland. So endocrine refers to hormones, and hormones are secreted into blood. And neuro refers to nervous tissue, neurons. What you basically have here is the adrenal medulla gland is the postganglionic axon. So that's the neuro part. The endocrine part is that instead of secreting neurotransmitter onto an effector, it secretes it into your blood. So now you have neurotransmitter, adrenaline, in your blood. This is the adrenaline rush. And because the neurotransmitter is in your blood, it is transported throughout the body. So you are making sure to hit every effector. There's no hiding from the blood. So every effector is going to get this adrenaline. And stuff in the blood stays for several minutes, whereas a nerve signal is a fraction of a second. So not only do you have it in the blood transported throughout the body so that you get all effectors, it also is prolonged because it stays in the blood for several minutes. As opposed to a nerve signal that only lasts a fraction of a second. So think about if something startles you or you have like a close call, your heart starts pounding and it keeps pounding for several minutes, or you get really angry at someone and it takes you a while to calm down. This is why it takes a while to calm down, because your adrenal medulla gland is putting adrenaline into the blood and causing that sympathetic response throughout your body for several minutes. So there's a comparison of the way sympathetic and parasympathetic are structured and how their structure is different from each other. Now we're going to look at neurotransmitters and receptors. So the autonomic nervous system is neurons stimulating each other and effectors. So remember, whenever a neuron stimulates something, it does so by secreting neurotransmitter. So we have two different neurotransmitters. Cholinergic refers to acetylcholine. So cholinergic is anytime you are using acetylcholine, which we abbreviate ACH. You may remember this. It's also the same neurotransmitter that we use to stimulate skeletal muscles. So this neurotransmitter is used to stimulate skeletal muscles in somatic. And it is used by the autonomic. So anytime you use the word cholinergic, that can refer to an axon that secretes acetylcholine, or a receptor that binds acetylcholine. And there are two different types of cholinergic receptors. They can be muscarinic or nicotinic. Then adrenergic refers to our other neurotransmitter. This one we have a few different names. Adrenergic is for adrenaline. Another name for adrenaline is epinephrine. And you actually secrete a very similar hormone called norepinephrine, which we're going to abbreviate NE. So throughout the rest of the notes, we're going to use NE to stand for norepinephrine, and that goes back to its other name, adrenaline. So adrenaline and epinephrine are just two different names for the same thing. And again, this can refer to an axon that secretes norepinephrine, or a receptor that binds it. And with our receptors that bind norepinephrine, we have four types. They can be alpha or beta, and then within each of those you have 1 and 2. So you have alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, beta 2. Now we're ready to start looking at the two divisions and which neurotransmitters and receptors they have. So this is our parasympathetic column. This is our sympathetic. Okay, here's our preganglionic and ganglionic neurons. So the brown ones up here are the preganglionic neurons. So these cell bodies would be in the CNS. In the parasympathetic, it could either be in the brain, because remember parasympathetic uses cranial nerves, or it could be in the lateral horn of the spine. And that would be the sacral region of the spine. For sympathetic, it's all going to be in the lateral horn, because remember, sympathetic comes from the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spine. Okay, then we have our axons that go out, and we synapse here with our ganglionic neuron, that have postganglionic axons. So if you don't remember these terms, take a minute and go back to when we took notes on this. Then down here at the bottom, we have our effectors. And remember, there's 3 effectors for autonomic: cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, glands. And then up here where the preganglionic and the ganglionic synapse, remember this is going to be your ganglion. Our neurotransmitters are color-coded for us. So the red ones here are all acetylcholine. So you can see that throughout the autonomic nervous system, whenever preganglionic is secreting neurotransmitter onto a ganglionic cell body, it uses acetylcholine. And these are going to be nicotinic receptors. And that is consistent throughout. So all three of these are nicotinic receptors. Then when we come down to the postganglionic secreting neurotransmitter onto the effector, here we have acetylcholine, here we have acetylcholine. And this time it's going to be muscarinic receptors. So you can see that for parasympathetic, it only uses acetylcholine. Parasympathetic is completely acetylcholine. It uses nicotinic receptors between the two neurons and muscarinic receptors on the effectors. So this would be all parasympathetic effectors. Anything that responds to parasympathetic is going to do so with muscarinic receptors. Then over here on our sympathetic side, some of them are acetylcholine and some are norepinephrine. And the effectors that use acetylcholine for sympathetic are going to be sweat glands and blood vessels of skeletal muscle. For the norepinephrine effectors, this is going to be all other sympathetic effectors. So anything that responds to sympathetic but is not a sweat gland or blood vessel of a skeletal muscle is going to respond to norepinephrine. So here's the basics of which neurotransmitters and which receptors you have. In the next few pictures, we'll look at some implications of this. So we mentioned the adrenal pathway before, but just to explain it a little more now that we know the receptors and neurotransmitters. So you have some different pathways here. And remember, the brown is the preganglionic. And the blue is your postganglionic axon. And in each of these four pictures, this is all sympathetic. Notice you have here your sympathetic trunk. Anytime you see this sympathetic trunk, you know that you're dealing with a sympathetic pathway. So the first picture here, we have a blood vessel of a skeletal muscle, and we have sweat glands. So this is the one where we're secreting acetylcholine. Next, we have sympathetic going to the heart and to the intestines. This is going to be that standard pathway that we talked about. So here, where you have that synapse in the ganglion, you're going to have acetylcholine. And then here, where we go on to the effector, you have norepinephrine. Same thing here. Norepinephrine here and acetylcholine here. And then remember also that up here with the acetylcholine, it's going to be the nicotinic receptors. So right here we have acetylcholine and nicotinic. Then down here with your effectors, this one is muscarinic. And these are going to be adrenergic receptors. The adrenal medulla pathway, remember, is unique. It's the exception. So here we have only preganglionic. Notice you go through the ganglia, but there is no synapse in the ganglia. So we're taking this other pathway, like for the heart and the intestine, and we're modifying it. So here, once you get to the gland, remember the adrenal medulla is a neuroendocrine gland. So it behaves as the postganglionic axons. So here, when you synapse between the preganglionic axon and the gland, that's going to be acetylcholine. And that's going to be on nicotinic receptors. So just like what you have here, it's that same type of synapse. But now we're putting that synapse on the effector instead of between two neurons. Then you're going to get norepinephrine coming from the gland into the blood. So over here you have, in the intestine and the heart, you have the postganglionic axon secreting norepinephrine onto the effector. Here with the adrenal medulla, the gland secretes norepinephrine into the blood. And remember, this is what then gives you that wide-ranging response where you reach all of your effectors and that long-lasting response. So this adrenal medulla pathway gives you a wide-ranging and long-lasting response. That's why your heart's still pounding for a few minutes after you've been frightened. That's why it takes a while to calm down when you get angry. Okay, then another idea we've touched on before, but now to give it some more information, is that whole idea of the teeter-totter and the tug-of-war. So remember, we said that with your autonomic nervous system, it's never actually turned off. You can have one side up and one side down, or you can be in balance. So if you have, put sympathetic and parasympathetic on here. So you can have a situation all the way on the left here where sympathetic is high and parasympathetic is low. This would be like an emergency. You're mostly in sympathetic, but the parasympathetic doesn't go away. It's still there. You can be a balance. You can be somewhere in between, right? Like you're mildly active. This one where parasympathetic high and sympathetic is turned down low would be like when you're resting. You're sitting on the couch, half asleep, watching an old TV show. The point is that neither one is ever completely gone. You always have both, but when one is higher, the other is lower. So the tug-of-war idea, you have some organs that respond to both. So they share effectors, right? So you might have a cell, and it's going to have both cholinergic and adrenergic receptors. So it might have a receptor here for acetylcholine, So it's going to have a cholinergic receptor. And it can have a receptor here for norepinephrine. So they're in a constant tug of war over this cell. The two divisions, so here would be parasympathetic, trying to make the cell do one thing, and over here would be sympathetic, trying to make the cell do the opposite. So they stimulate the cell to do opposite things of each other. A couple of examples of this stimulating the cell to do opposite things. You have your heart. Sympathetic speeds it up. It makes your heart beat faster. Parasympathetic slows it down. So your heart rate depends on how much sympathetic and parasympathetic. So for example, over here, when you are in the emergency and sympathetic is high, your heart is going to be fast. When you're resting on the couch and parasympathetic is the one that's high, you're going to have a slow heart rate. If they're balanced, you're going to have a medium heart rate. Another example is the pupil of your eye. Sympathetic wants it to dilate. Parasympathetic wants it to constrict. So the exact size of your pupil just depends on how much of each stimulation you have. This is important because a lot of medical treatments work by manipulating this. You can take medicines that will either block a receptor so that you knock one of these out of the tug of war and the other automatically wins, or you can take medicines that will enhance a receptor and make it more active. So, for example, if you take a medicine that blocks an adrenergic receptor, parasympathetic wins that tug of war, and it gets control of that effector. Or you can take a medicine that will stimulate one of the receptors. So in class, we're going to go over some specific examples of things that block or stimulate the receptors in order to manipulate this tug of war. There are also effectors that only respond to one division and not the other. An example is your blood vessels. So blood vessels are sympathetic only. Okay, so blood vessels can constrict or dilate depending on how much sympathetic. So there's no parasympathetic to counteract it. For most blood vessels, when sympathetic is up, they will constrict. So increased sympathetic will make them constrict. So this is most blood vessels. And decreased sympathetic will make them dilate. For the blood vessels of your skeletal muscle, it's the opposite. When sympathetic is high, they dilate. And when sympathetic is low, they constrict. So kind of think of this as a car with no brakes. You only have a gas pedal. When you increase, when you step on the gas, you go faster. If you let your foot off the gas, you slow down and coast to a stop. That's how it is with blood vessels. There's no parasympathetic to counteract. You just have them constrict or dilate based on the amount of sympathetic. So in this case, some effectors respond only to sympathetic, and they change based on the amount of sympathetic. All right, so there are your neurotransmitters and receptors and what's going on with those in the autonomic nervous system. Now we're ready to put it all together and look at the complete picture of autonomic stimulation. So we're going to start with the parasympathetic. So remember, with parasympathetic, you have the long preganglionic. Then you have a short postganglionic. And if we look at the effects of this, you're going to have cranial nerve 3. So this one is CN3. It goes to the eyes and it will constrict the pupils. Then we have cranial nerve 7, the facial. Notice it branches to 2 different places. It goes to the lacrimal gland, where it will stimulate the production of tears, and it goes to the sublingual and submandibular salivary glands. Then you have glossopharyngeal, number 9. It goes to the parotid salivary gland. And in both cases, you're going to stimulate more saliva production. Remember, this is the rest and digest, and having saliva is part of the digestive system. Then we have the vagus, number 10. This one does the most. This is the one you're going to hear about in a lot of future chapters. It goes to the heart and it decreases heart rate. So the vagus causes the heart to slow down. It goes to the respiratory system and it causes bronchoconstriction. So it's going to make your airways narrow so that you get less air in and out with each breath. The vagus nerve also goes to the digestive system and it stimulates increased digestive activities. So remember, rest and digest. You digest more while you're resting. And think about if you have a really lazy day where you're just laying around versus a busy, hectic day, you tend to get hungry more on the lazy day. When you're resting, you're working on digesting your food. You run through it faster. If you're busy, you're not resting, you're not digesting. Your food tends to sit there, so you're not hungry later because you still haven't digested breakfast. Okay. Then we move on. The nerves from the sacral region are the pelvic splanchnic nerves. These nerves go to the rectum and to the bladder, and they're going to stimulate you to need to use the bathroom. So just like you tend to get hungry more on a lazy day, you tend to use the bathroom more on a lazy day. They also go to the genitals and cause erection. And in men, it would be erection of the penis, and in women, erection of the clitoris. And remember that for neurotransmitters, it is all acetylcholine. Now we come over to sympathetic. Sympathetic, remember, has the short preganglionic and the long postganglionic. And where these two synapses is going to be acetylcholine is cholinergic. If we look at some of the effects, notice you have a nerve that goes to the eye. This time it's going to dilate the pupil. So the opposite effect of what we had with the parasympathetic. You go to the heart and it's going to do the opposite again. It's going to increase your heart rate. Sympathetic also increases the force of contraction. So think about when you have a fight or flight, your heart is pounding. So it makes your heart go faster and it makes it beat harder. And in the respiratory system, it's going to stimulate bronchodilation. So you're going to open your airways and you're going to let more air in and out with each breath. Notice that in these situations, you're having your synapse in the sympathetic trunk. This next set of nerves pass through the sympathetic trunk, but they don't synapse there. Instead, they synapse in a prevertebral ganglia. These nerves that synapse in a prevertebral ganglia are called splanchnic nerves. So this is where it gets confusing. Over here we have pelvic splanchnic nerves. Pelvic splanchnic nerves are parasympathetic nerves from the sacral region of the spine. So when you see pelvic splanchnic nerves, that's what it means. It's parasympathetic from the sacral region. And you can kind of remember and think of PSPS, pelvic splanchnic, parasympathetic, sacral. Over here, we don't have the word pelvic. We just say splanchnic nerves. So when you just see the word splanchnic, no pelvic, it is sympathetic. And it means that they synapse in a prevertebral ganglion. So we have the digestive system. We're going to decrease digestive activities. If you're in an emergency or you're really active, you can't divert your blood and your energy to digesting food. So you inhibit that. We also have the liver and the adipose. They store nutrients. You'll recall that the liver stores glycogen and the adipose stores your lipids. They are going to release their stores. This will give you more glucose. Remember, glycogen breaks down to glucose and lipid in your blood because when you're active, you need ATP. So this way you have plenty of nutrients to make ATP with. The rectum and the bladder, depending on the situation, a couple of things can happen. If there's a sudden life-threatening emergency, people do tend to soil themselves. So you kind of jettison what's in there. You empty it, you get rid of that extra weight, so then you can deal with the emergency and not have that extra weight you're carrying around. So in a real emergency, they will empty. If it's just a busy, hectic day, then they tend to be inhibited. Think about like if you have a busy, hectic day at work and it's just go, go, go. You can go all day and not eat and not go to the bathroom because you're just so busy and hectic. And then with the genitals, we get ejaculation. All of these are going to be norepinephrine. So everything over here, we're secreting norepinephrine onto the effector. Then we also have on this side sweat glands. So sympathetic is going to stimulate your sweat glands and it's going to make you sweat. You're going to make more sweat. And remember, this one uses acetylcholine. Then we have blood vessels, and depending on the situation, depending on where the blood vessel is if it will dilate or constrict. So sympathetic, remember, if you increase your sympathetic activity, most blood vessels will constrict. The only ones that dilate are the blood vessels in your skeletal muscle. So if you look at the net effect, you get overall more constriction than dilation. So there's more blood vessels everywhere else in your body than in just your skeletal muscles. This comes important in blood pressure. With blood pressure, constriction raises blood pressure. So since the overall effect of sympathetic is constriction, sympathetic raises blood pressure. Even though some of the vessels are dilating, more are constricting, so you have a net effect of constriction. All right, so there is your summary, kind of the big picture of the two divisions of autonomic. And remember, you tend to slide back and forth between them. You can be all the way at one end, you can be all the way at the other, or you can be somewhere in between. And if one is higher, the other is lower.